The purpose of this presentation is to show you the basics of creating a pivot table. We're going to start with this database, which is created from data from Standard & Poor's CompuStat, and it has descriptive information on a large number of companies. What we're going to do is create a pivot table from this information and then see what we can do with that pivot table. So, if you look, I want to focus on the column H, which is the Altman Z-score result, and then we'll also be using the S&P quality rating, and we're going to see how much agreement there is with those two scoring mechanisms for bankruptcy. So what we're going to do is create a pivot table. Two things to keep in mind. First, the worksheet that you're using to create the pivot table must be a saved worksheet. It cannot just be a working copy and that hasn't been saved. So if you're downloading data from another source, then you need to make sure that you've saved the worksheet as an Excel file before creating the pivot table. Another thing to keep in mind is that the pivot table, you're going to designate columns for this. The pivot table cannot be created if there are any columns without a descriptor at the top. If it doesn't have a heading at the top of the column, the pivot table will not work. So you have to, any column has to have a label at the top. Alright, now to do this, if we just want to do a pivot table of the entire worksheet, which is a fairly large worksheet, what I'm going to do is just click in the left hand corner here and select everything. Now you can select certain information. You can take and click and drag and identify a set of information that you want to use in a pivot table. If you want to do everything, just click in that upper left hand corner to do that. Then you would insert pivot table, and we'll just let it default to a new worksheet. It's easier to have the pivot table on a separate worksheet because this worksheet is all full of data and it would require you to then do everything several columns over, and that'd be inconvenient. So we're just going to go ahead and create a new worksheet. Now we've got basically a blank slate. Now what we've got is this field list on the right hand side. If it does not appear, you can always go to options and click on this to make it appear. So you can click that on and off. Now you'll notice that all the variables are listed here. What we're going to do is actually just create a simple table. We're going to take the Altman Z-score result, that's the bankruptcy likely, etc., and we're going to put that in the column labels. Then we're going to also then take the S&P quality rating and put it in the row labels. So now we've got basically a table but nothing in it. Now what we'd like to do is actually just have a count of how many are in each cell in this table. So we need to choose some variable that will appear with these variables, with these firms, that they'll all have. So we could just go ahead and take any variable, truthfully, and for example fiscal year, and bring it down to values. Now the default is counting. So if we click on the drop down and you see the value settings, the default is the count. So if I just want to count, I could actually take any of the variables and just count. Now if I was going to use this table to find averages of a variable and so forth, then I would of course switch this at this point, but the default is to count. So how many firms fell into the individual cells. Now what we're going to do is clean up the table. There are different ways to clean it up. First thing you might want to do is click on either the row or the column labels and take off any blanks. So for example, in this data set there are some firms for which Standard & Poor's does not provide a quality rating, so we want to ignore those firms. We could also go into the column labels and ignore any blanks there. So if there were some observations where we could not actually classify, then we'll leave those out. So now we've got the observations. There are 3,447 of them, and we have the distribution here. So we can see, for example, the lower quality rating, which goes down to the C and the D and the S&P rating. And in terms of bankruptcy likely, that's the more prominent classification. Now we could do this graphically if we want. We could always take this information, highlight it, and then insert a graph. And in this case we could do, say, a stack graph. Now when you do a graph within the pivot tables, you'll have all of the horizontal labels for you. Now that doesn't happen when you do a regular graph, but in the pivot tables it does. Now you have different options that you can do here. You can actually take away some of these, the blanks at that time. You can perhaps leave out a segment. For example, if you left out the unsure at this time, it would appear as such. And so we see is that, of course, the lower quality rating also scores high in terms of the bankruptcy is likely, or in the case of a Z-score, that means they score less than 1.81. Now there are different things you can do in terms of dressing this table up. If you go ahead and click anywhere within the pivot table or the chart that was created, the field list will appear. And you can change this around. For example, if you just wanted to know the, say, the average Altman Z-score, well, you can put that down here. Take this, drag this one out of here, and now we could do actually the average. So you'd have the average. Now the graphing of that isn't as interesting, but you'd have the average. And so on. Also, when you're in pivot tables and you have the pivot table tools up there, you have some options. You can use these options to report or not report certain items. For example, if you don't want the grand totals for rows and columns, you can take those off at this time. So you can use the options, which will appear anytime you click within this area here or click in here. You'll have the options appear. So if we just wanted something else in here, if we wanted, say, total assets, we could move that instead of the count if we want the average, and so on. So these would be the total assets. And what you see, if you looked at this graph right here, larger firms have higher quality rankings, lower firms tend to have the lower ratings. But there are many things you can do just by clicking and dragging. So what you want to do is you can drag things back and forth. You can switch rows and columns. And I'll go ahead and get rid of that graph so we can play with this. You can put other variables in there. So if you wanted current liabilities, for example, and you wanted, say, the average current liabilities, you could do that, and so forth. So there are different ways that you can construct this. You can move things around all you want. And you can just drag something away at your leisure. And now you're back to the beginning.